The new documentary Active Measures details Russian efforts and tactics used to influence elections, both in Eastern Europe and in the 2016 presidential election. Earlier, I sat down with director Jack Bryan to discuss the process and findings in his new film. Throughout this movie, you are going through the very complicated web of Russian figures and their potential ties to President Trump. According to what you uncovered as you went about the process of working on this film, how far back do these potential connections go?
Yeah, that was one of the interesting things about making this film, is that whenever we try to create a starting point for when this association began, we always had to push it farther and farther and farther back because we kept finding new things. And so we started with the first clear line of illegality on the Trump side, which was when he sold 5 apartments in Trump Tower to David Bogatin. He did this personally, and he was a Russian mobster, David Bogatin, and the state attorney general ruled that it was money laundering. And we kind of track Trump's relationship with the Russian mob going forward. With Vladimir Putin, we really show his rise and the sort of origin of his animus towards the West, and the rise of his election meddling programs.
And that first set of transactions with Bogatin, when was that? What year was that?
That's 1984, and Trump Tower had just opened up, and it was only the second building in New York that allowed shell companies to purchase units, and so it became this perfect vehicle for money laundering.
Because people didn't need to necessarily identify who was actually purchasing these.
And because these guys also weren't taking out loans from a bank, the only person that was seeing that was the broker, who was usually in on it.
So let me ask about the tracing back of President Trump's presidential aspirations, because that was something that was part of the film as well. You went back and you took a look at the actions dating back how far that would seem to suggest that Donald Trump was thinking about the presidency perhaps a lot earlier than most people realized.
Yeah, when Donald Trump married Ivana, the Czech secret police started monitoring him. And they found in their communications that that he'd been planning on running as early as 1988. And they loved the idea of him running because his wife was Czech and this would be great for the Soviet Union. And so they were keeping a close eye on him after that moment.
So in the 80s, this is according to, I just want to be clear, this was according to a document that you were able to obtain that shows Czech police understood he had presidential aspirations back then, and they thought it would be advantageous for them.
Yes, absolutely.
And so you say that also in the film, Donald Trump was someone who was essentially marked by the Russians early on as being sort of a target. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, he sort of was the perfect soup for a Russian intelligence operation, if you will. At first, he was willing to work with them. We understand that because since 1984, they've been doing some slight money laundering. He was a high-profile guy, so wouldn't attract a lot of attention and money going in there. But most importantly, he was broke. In the early 90s, when his casinos in Atlantic City went bankrupt, he started what became a series of bankruptcies that went until about 2004. And once the 2004 bankruptcies came out, the Russian mob apparently made the move on him. They realized he would not be able to get seed capital for future buildings, and that they were his best ticket. And so Bayrock, a Russian-run real estate firm, moves into Trump Tower, starts leasing space, and working directly with Trump for his next properties.
And so that was really, in the film, you explore sort of how then the connections developed from that point forward. You say that this film is particularly timely when we look at Paul Manafort and what has just happened, where he's been convicted of 8 of 18 counts, but he's got another trial coming up in September that could look more specifically at the kinds of things you examine in your film. Tell me a little bit about that. What is it that you found with respect to Paul Manafort and his connections to the Russians and the Trump organization?
Yeah, I mean, the connections with the Russians really start in 2004 with Manafort as well, actually. He had been working around the world as a campaign advisor. He'd worked in Angola, Philippines, usually supporting dictators. And he got brought into Ukraine right after what's called the Orange Revolution, where the Russians had tried to put a person in, they tried to rig an election there, and it failed. People stood up to it and overturned it. And the person who was the Russian-backed candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, afterwards he was discredited, and the country saw him as just a Russian puppet. So they brought Paul Manafort into Ukraine to re-establish Yanukovych's credibility. And so he worked within Yanukovych's, the pro-Russian party, and built up Yanukovych into a president. throughout that, he's also doing deals where he's working with a man named Dmitry Firtash, who's very piped into the Russian-Ukrainian gas trade, which is a completely mob-run operation. And they would steal money from that, and through Manafort, through other people, they would launder it into America. Manafort, in fact, himself bought a Trump Tower apartment in 2006. And so this process, and a lot of the people associated with the Trump Organization seem to also be associated with the Russian-Ukraine gas trade.
The notion for a lot of people, I think, to have the mob working hand in glove with the government here in the U.S. is probably maybe not something that they would envision in an easy way. So can you just describe how close the relationship is between organized Russian organizations, the criminal organizations? How closely do they, are their connections and their relationships to the Russian government?
This is an incredibly important issue, absolutely. So the high-ups, Vladimir Putin and his sort of ilk within his sort of entourage within the Kremlin are constantly stealing money from the country. It's the nature of corruption. And so they need a way to funnel that money into safer jurisdictions where the currency is stable, where they're not going to get caught, and the money is protected. And so they use the mafia to launder that money into other countries. So the Russian mafia, and it has, except for a brief period during the 80s, has for many decades worked as a branch of the Russian government.
It's not a separate organization.
Not at all. The head of the Russian mafia, Semyon Mogilevich, who's that brainy Don, is what he's known as. He's got an economics degree. He's got $10 billion. He lives in Russia.
Economic mastermind of how to move the money around.
Exactly. He's the money laundering mastermind of this whole thing. He's the Kaiser Soze of the Russian mob, if you will.
And so he is somebody that then you draw all these other connections to. But I think for a lot of people that's important sort of as a basis, because it's at that point then that these various figures associated with the Russian mob sort of take a look at the opportunities that they might be able to find in and around the Trump Organization.
Absolutely. And in fact, one thing that's important is that one of the reasons that they also use the Russian mob, so for example, Bayrock, one of the likely reasons that Bayrock was the company that was used to sort of funnel that money through Trump was that the Russian government needs to know where the oligarchs are putting their money. They want to keep track of it. And so if that guy falls out of favor, they want to know where he stashed his money. And so that's why they use these what are called nodes, which are basically just focal points that money has to pass through. It's usually a broker, basically. And so that's where the mob really comes in.
Let me ask you about the folks that you spoke with for this film. There are a number of high-profile interviews that you conducted, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, but one of the most prominent voices is particularly striking this week is the late Senator John McCain. Tell me about what his views were regarding Russia and Vladimir Putin in particular, because there's one scene that you show in the film that I thought was particularly remarkable, where Vladimir Putin at the security conference is being very forceful in his language, critical of the West, and directing his comments seemingly at Senator McCain, taking a moment to make eye contact and as if to let Senator McCain know he's not afraid of him. What was Senator McCain's view on Russia and Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, McCain has had Putin's number from the beginning. He is, now I'm a Democrat, but I have to say that nobody in the Senate has done as much to push back against Russian aggression as John McCain had. He was a true soldier on this issue. And also, beyond that, he just recognized what was going on when people didn't want to see it. And so that's why he and Hillary Clinton were really natural choices, because since 2004, they have been working together on this issue. They both visited Ukraine then, and they've been real advocates for democracy in Europe, especially Eastern Europe, where it has been a threat. And so, yeah, John McCain has understood this issue, and also he had access to intelligence as the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. And so I think that he just knew what was going on before anybody else and stood by it and never wavered.
What was his perception of Vladimir Putin's sort of vision and intention for Russia?
Yeah, he would say that Vladimir Putin wants to recreate the Russian Empire in an almost even pre-Soviet concept of it, that it is expansive, that it controls all of the countries in what they call the near abroad. That's Ukraine, Georgia, Estonia, the Baltic countries, as well. And so it's about control. And I think that that is his primary goal. He sees the fall of the Soviet Union as the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. And his goal is to rebuild that and the notion of a Russian empire.
The reason why you spoke to Senator McCain in particular, I wonder, were there any other voices? You say you're a Democrat. Were there any other voices on the Republican side that you thought about including?
Well, within the film, though not everybody has an R or D next to their name, about 13 of the 30 people we interviewed are Republicans. And some of them are just think tank people, but we wanted to have a really broad set of voices speaking to this in the American political spectrum.
I wonder, with Senator McCain's passing, is there another voice that exists, do you think, that would have shared that same perspective when it comes to Vladimir Putin and Russia on the Republican side?
Yeah, I think Mitt Romney, while he hasn't been nearly to the degree, or I think has been pretty open and aware and doesn't pretend to not see things that are clearly there.
For people who are watching this and have skepticism about the notion of Robert Mueller's investigation, and who may be supporters of the president and fully believe when he says this is a political witch hunt, they think to themselves, that sounds about right, because so far, despite months of investigation, there has not been a direct line drawn from the Russians to the president. What would you say?
Well, I'd say that investigations take a lot of time and they move at their own pace. But as citizens, we don't have to rely on investigations to inform ourselves. There's plenty of journalism. I think the investigations can be a good backstop, but there's journalism, and there's us looking into and digging into things ourselves.
I think there will be people who are
Sure.
who are skeptical, because that's certainly a question I get when I leave New York and Washington, is the notion that, why do you guys talk so much about Russia? You're talking about things that don't matter to the country. Why is it important, do you think, for people to go ahead and watch a film like yours?
Yeah, I mean, because it is a threat to them. Whether they acknowledge it or not, it is a threat to them, and it is a threat to the way they live their life. And I think that if people are skeptical today, I would say that's fine, but don't let yourself get brought into a place where you're okay with it. Where you're like, okay, I'm okay with it because it's Trump, or I'm okay with it because I voted for it, because it's going to cross a certain point where that's not going to be a thing that people think anymore, that it didn't happen. And my concern is people aren't going to be like, oh, it did happen, that's frightening. What they're going to transition to is, oh, it happened, I'm okay with that. And that is a dangerous place for us to go, because then that opens us up into every future election, that every major country is going to have their candidate that they're going to back. And if we're just okay with it, then that's going to be the end result. I think skepticism is good generally, but I think we've passed the point of reasonable skepticism.
Jack Bryan, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.